Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and it is day one of the mandatory shelter-in-place, stay the heck home, whatever you want to call it, order in the state of California. And I'm not entirely sure that I'm so good at working from home. I don't know. I mean, I'm a massive introvert, as you know, so working from home should be great. And I know I got a ton of stuff done today, but it just feels like I got nothing done today. I don't know. We'll see how it goes from here on out. I mean, I flatten the curve. I'm totally on board with that. And as an introvert, I don't mind staying home. Just not sure that I have the system down yet for working from home. At any rate, I do know how to do podcasts from home and to work on those. I can do that. And thankfully, as I said in the last episode, podcasts can be done, interviews can be done with the appropriate amount of social distancing. So I am happy that today I have a long overdue interview to share with you. I originally spoke with Andrew Maranis in February. I think it was February 10th or so, and we had a lovely conversation. And then I went to post the episode, edit the episode, and it turns out that it didn't record. Yeah, really not so sure what happened there. You can bet I double-checked about 84,000 times during our conversation today. But thankfully, he was patient and understanding, and he was willing to reschedule. Then, of course, there was a tornado in Nashville, and then the coronavirus, and I don't know, it's just all kinds of craziness. So we finally were able to reschedule for today, and I am very appreciative that we were able to, and that we were able to get this interview recorded, and I can share it with you. So, as I said, the author that I am interviewing today is Andrew Maranis, and he writes historical nonfiction. He writes his first book was called Strong Enough, and his second book, the one that we're speaking about today, is called Games of Deception. Let me make sure that I get the subtitle correct. So it's called Games of Deception, the true story of the first U.S. Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Hitler's Germany. It is written for young adults, and here is the description. On a scorching hot day in July 1936, thousands of people cheered as the U.S. Olympic teams boarded the SS Manhattan bound for Berlin. Among the athletes were the 14 players representing the first ever U.S. Olympic basketball team. As thousands of supporters waved American flags on the docks, it was easy to miss the one courageous man holding a Boycott Nazi Germany sign. But it was too late for a boycott now. The ship had already left the harbor. 1936 was a turbulent time in world history. Adolf Hitler had gained power in Germany 3 years earlier. Jewish people and political opponents of the Nazis were the targets of vicious mistreatment, yet were unaware of the horrors that awaited them in the coming years. But the Olympians on board the SS Manhattan and other international visitors wouldn't see any signs of trouble in Berlin. Streets were swept, storefronts were painted, and every German citizen greeted them with a smile. Like a movie set, it was all just a facade, meant to distract from the terrible things happening behind the scenes. This is the incredible true story of basketball, from its invention by James Naismith in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1891, to the sport's Olympic debut in Berlin, and the eclectic mix of people, events, and propaganda on both sides of the Atlantic that made it all possible. The book includes photos throughout, a who's who of the 1936 Olympics, bibliography, and index. This book is so well done. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It is, as I said, written for young adults, but that obviously doesn't mean that, adults can't read it. Of course we can read it. I'm all the time reading stuff for young adults, but this just means that it's a quick read, it's engaging, and it in no way condescends or talks down in terms of the subject matter, but it's written in a way that is maybe more engaging for a younger audience. But that just I think means it's also more engaging for a not as younger audience. And really, what is age? We're all as old as we feel, right? So this is so well done, and it touches on so many important historical, social, cultural events, circumstances, what have you. And unfortunately, there's so many things that are talked about in this book that are still timely, that are still concerns for today. There's a lot of parallels between this book and what is going on in the world today. So just really well done, and I very much recommend it, especially if you have someone in your family who is interested in history, or you're trying to get them interested in history. You can kind of use that sports angle maybe if they're a sports fan, and sneak a little history into their reading habits. At any rate, let's go ahead and turn to the interview with Andrew so he can talk more about the book. Again, it is called Games of Deception, and let's turn now to that interview. Hi, Andrew. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Actually, I should say welcome back to the podcast, because we tried doing this a while ago, and there were technical difficulties. So thank you for coming back to speak to me about your new book. Before we get to the book, though, if you could start by sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to be back on. Hopefully I'll remember anything interesting I said last time. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and been holed up here with my family the last several days due to coronavirus, but I have a wife and 2 kids, 9 and 6. I work at Vanderbilt University in the athletic department there as a visiting author, which is a great title. I don't think that too many athletic departments have that, but the reason that came about is my first book was a book called Strong Inside, which was a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first African-American basketball player in the SEC, and he had gone to Vanderbilt in the late 60s, which is also the school that I went to in the 1980s and 90s, after having grown up in Wisconsin and Washington, D.C., and Austin, Texas. So I live in Nashville. I don't sing or play music or anything like that, but I'm here in Music City and writing books and working by day in an athletic department, which I really enjoy.
That's very cool. I don't know that I've ever heard of an author in an athletic department like that. So that's very cool.
Yeah, I've never heard of it either. The former athletic director, David Williams, was an avid reader and really into history, and especially into U.S. civil rights history. And so he was a mentor and a supporter of my book. And after it came out, Strong Inside was required to be read by every freshman at Vanderbilt for 2 years in a row, kind of learn this history of their school. And we started something called the Sports and Society Initiative, which studies issues related to race, gender, and sports. And so I've helped launch and manage that program.
Very cool.
So speaking of sports and history, that's an excellent segue into your new book, which is called Games of Deception. Can you give an overview of the story?
Sure. Games of Deception is sports nonfiction again. It's the true story of the first U.S. Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. This book really has three main threads to it, I would say. The first is the invention of the game of basketball itself by James Naismith in 1891, and who was this man and why did he invent basketball? How did the sport grow internationally within just 45 years and during his lifetime that he could invent the game and then see it played in the Olympics? The second is, how was this first team put together? Who were the members of the first U.S. Dream Team, and what were their backstories? And then the third and most important aspect of the book is, what was the world like at this time? What was it like to be an athlete in Berlin, in Nazi Germany in 1936? What was the state of politics in the U.S. and in Germany during this pre-war period, and what are the lessons that we can learn from it today?
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the origins of basketball, something that I didn't have a clue about, frankly, before I read this book. So I got to learn something new and very interesting. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with Andrew Maranis about his historical book, Games of Deception. And before the break, he was talking about some of the parallels that occur between the book and now, and just an overview of that book. So when we pick back up, I am agreeing with what he had just said. There was no great place to make that cut, so I just left it as it is. But you are all my brilliant listeners, and I know you'll figure it out. So let's get back to the interview.
Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting aspects of the book. I was really intrigued because I realized as I was reading the beginning of the book that I had no idea why we have basketball in the world. And it really came about because of kind of a challenge of, here, create something. We need a sport. And so he did.
Yeah. I really enjoyed doing that research. I went up to Springfield, Massachusetts, where James Naismith was a student at the International YMCA Training School. And it was essentially a graduate school that trained at that time just young men to go out around the world and run YMCAs. And this was a school with students from all over the world, and they would play baseball in the spring and they would play football in the fall, but they really had nothing to do in the winter. They had a gymnasium, but obviously this was a world without basketball, and so they would march or they would stretch. They played leapfrog, and these were guys in their 20s. They were bored, and so one of their professors challenged a class and said, someone's got to come up with a new game to keep us busy in the winter, and we can share this game with Ys around the world. And so one student raised his hand to accept this challenge. It was Naismith. He had 2 weeks to come up with an invention of a new game. And like most students, he waited until the night before his assignment was due, and that was the night that he came up with the game of basketball in his head. the pieces of paper where the rules were first typed out still exist. And seeing those pieces of paper is what gave me the idea for this book. They're now under glass at the University of Kansas, in the place called the DeBruce Center, which is next to Allen Fieldhouse, where Kansas Jayhawks play basketball today. So anyway, Naismith invented the game at this night, and the next morning he took his fellow classmates onto the court. The custodian at the school nailed up the peach baskets on the wall. That's why it's called basketball. They shot into peach baskets, and the reason why every hoop today is 10 feet off the ground is only because that custodian happened to nail the peach baskets 10 feet off the ground in that first basketball game. And that was because there was an elevated running track above the floor in this gymnasium, and that was 10 feet off the ground. And so those were the beginnings of this amazing international sport that we all know and love. You know, it was in one school and one gymnasium in Massachusetts in 1891 was when it was first played.
Yeah, and it's amazing because it was first played in Massachusetts, but there were a lot of international students there who then took it back to their home countries. And so it spread a lot quicker than you might have expected, which is why it ended up at the Olympics in 1936. So,
exactly. And so when you think about how could a game just played at one school spread when there's no, I talk a lot to kids today about the book, no technology. How did the word spread? And it was through people that graduated from the school, took the sport back with them to their countries. Also, the school had a newsletter that they mailed out to Ys all over the world, and they printed the rules in this newsletter. And that's how, just within a couple of years, this game really spread quickly all around the world. And of course, basketball is a fun game, so people enjoyed playing it, and it became very popular very quickly.
Yeah. So let's talk about then the next aspect of the story, which is the first Olympic basketball team. Why is this particular basketball team important in the history of not only basketball, but also in the context of World War II?
Sure. Well, they're important in the history of basketball simply because they were the first. And I'll share a little bit about that. And in telling that story, the more important historical context comes into play. So what they decided to do that year was, today the tryouts for an Olympic team would be like they would be at any school or any other type of team where individuals would try out and a coach would pick the best players to be on the team. What they decided to do back then was different. It was to have a tournament. And the best amateur teams in the country were invited to participate in this tournament. At that time, the best amateur teams weren't just college teams, but also teams from YMCAs and AAU teams. Now AAU would be high school players. Back then it was college graduates. There was no NBA, so what the best players would do is play for company teams. And these were sponsored by the AAU. And I should say that this tournament wasn't open to all players. It was only open to the best white teams in the country. So one aspect of my book is discussing segregation in the United States and how that compared to anti-Semitism in Germany at the time. So the best African-American teams in the country weren't eligible to try out for this tournament. There also wasn't women's basketball in the 36 Olympics. That didn't come along until the 1976 Olympics, 40 years later. So this tournament was played, and the top 8 teams met at Madison Square Garden in New York City. And the idea was whichever 2 teams advanced to the championship game, their entire rosters would be combined to become one U.S. Olympic basketball team. The 2 teams that made it to the championship, one was from McPherson, Kansas. These guys worked at an oil refinery, the Globe Refinery in McPherson. There was one significant player on that team. His name is Joe Fortenberry, and he's considered the first player ever to dunk the basketball in a game. He did it in one of those games in New York, and a sports writer from the New York Times saw this, and it was unusual. No one had ever seen a dunk before, and so he had to come up with a way to describe what this looked like to his readers. And the words that he used was, he said it looked like a cafeteria customer dunking their donut in coffee. And that's where the term dunk comes from this guy, Joe Fortenberry from McPherson, Kansas. The other half of the team that they met in the championship of the qualifying tournament, came from very different circumstances. They came from Hollywood. And these players worked at Universal Studios, or Universal Pictures in Hollywood. They worked on the sets of movies. And they had a significant player on their team. His name was Sam Balter. And the reason why he matters is he was Jewish. And so when their team won the qualifying tournament and qualified to go to Berlin, a reporter asked him, are you going to go? And that was a significant question. He had to decide whether he would participate in an Olympics in Nazi Germany. And Sam Balter made the decision to go. He felt like, based on what he knew at that time, the best thing he could do would be to go to Berlin, to perform well, to win a gold medal, and that would be the way that he would refute Hitler. And Jesse Owens, as an African American, really sort of had the same question. There were people arguing and trying to persuade him not to go to the Olympics. And they said racism anywhere is racism everywhere, and you can't do this. But again, he decided the best thing he could do would be to go to Berlin and win gold medals, and he won 4 of them. By far was the star of those Olympics. But, one point I make in the book is that, yes, Balter and Owens performed well and certainly refuted these notions of Aryan supremacy, but beyond the sports aspect, it's difficult to say that it mattered. It didn't. The Olympics and their performance in the Olympics didn't stop the Holocaust. It didn't slow Hitler down at all. And even when these men returned to the United States, Sam Balter lost his job for participating in the Olympics. Jesse Owens couldn't find work, was reduced to racing against horses as a way to make a buck. And certainly he inspired African Americans who participated in the civil rights movement to come. But it's a complicated question to say whether their elite performance at the Olympics accomplished much.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. As we go to break, I want to share my 6 degrees of separation story with Jesse Owens. It turns out that when my hubby was a small boy, he and his mom were in an airport. I don't know where they were traveling, but they were at an airport, and a man came up and was speaking with them. And being a small boy and being kind of bored, my husband ended up falling asleep, and the man was very kind and covered him up with his, I think he said it was a fur coat. It turns out that man was Jesse Owens. And so somewhere in my in-laws' house in Ohio, there is a picture of my hubby as a small child, and he was adorable as a kid, sleeping under Jesse Owens' coat. Is Jesse Owens in the picture? I don't remember. That's crazy. I'm going to have to double check. I'll get back to you on that. But how cool is that? Obviously, I have never met him, but I have that connection somewhere in the past through my husband. So, enough about me and my adorable hubby. Let's go ahead and take another break. And when we come back, we'll be continuing the interview with Andrew. So stay tuned. Oh, by the way, my husband's first name happens to be Andrew. So there you go. More connections. Let's take that break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Andrew Maranis about his most recent book. It's called Games of Deception. Let's get back to that interview.
Right. Yeah. There's so many different aspects. I mean, we could have a very long conversation just on the Olympics, not only the basketball team, but the Olympics as a whole, and the stories
Right.
of Jewish athletes who were there, and some of them then didn't get to participate for various reasons, but really underlying anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, and you said something about racism here is racism everywhere, which yeah, well, Jesse Owens didn't face much better situation here at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
So
a lot of the black athletes said they were treated better in Germany during the Olympics than they were in the United States. So
right.
Yeah, it's a major aspect of the book.
Yeah, which is it's sad to know. How much research did you do for the book?
Well, quite a bit. I think that research is the most important part of writing nonfiction. Every single sentence has to come from some research that you've done. With Strong Inside, I spent 8 years on the book, 4 years of research and 4 years of writing. That was my first book, so I didn't have an agent or a publisher waiting on it, so I could afford to spend that much time. With this book, I just had a year, and so I spent about 6 months on the research, traveling to important archives around the United States and Canada, and then I spent another 6 months writing the book. So quicker pace with this book. And one thing that made that possible was that in this case, all the key players in the story have passed away. And so it wasn't a book that was based on as many interviews. I probably only interviewed about 15 people for this book. I'd talked to close to 100 for my book on Perry Wallace. And so it's time consuming to find people, to set up interviews, to travel to visit them. And so with this one, I had 5 or 6 key archives to visit, maybe 10 or 20 books to read, read through a lot of old newspaper articles from the 1930s, and was able to find the sons and daughters of many of the Olympians, and those were the people that I had my most productive interviews with, as well as a man named Dr. Al Miller, who's now 97 years old, who attended those Olympics as a 13-year-old Jewish kid living in Berlin. And it was really a fascinating, enjoyable experience for me to talk to Dr. Miller. He appears in the book as a character both in the 1930s and then again at the very end of the book in present day.
Yeah, I love his story. I would actually, I would read a book just on his story, but speak to students about his experience.
I do, and so Dr. Miller, as I mentioned, in 36, he was a 13-year-old kid living in Berlin, seeing the world change before his eyes. Friends kids that had been his friends at school, all of a sudden they're turning on him because he's Jewish. They're bullying him. They're joining the Hitler Youth and marching in front of his house, singing songs about how they'll beat up and kill Jewish people, and he's sort of scared and fascinated by this at the same time. He rides his bike to the Olympic Stadium. He says the first African-American person he ever saw in his life was Jesse Owens, winning one of his gold medals. But the next year, his parents, can kind of sense and feel what might be to come, and they're worried about the safety of their son and of themselves. And so they send Al at age 14 to the United States by himself. He's not sure if he'll ever see his parents again. Meanwhile, his mom is searching for fake passports to get herself and her husband, Al's dad, out of the country, while Al's dad goes to the hospital and has 2 unnecessary surgeries, 2 unnecessary appendectomies, just as an excuse to be hiding in the hospital while the Nazis are looking for him at his house. And thanks to some doctors who protect him at the hospital, he's able to stay there for a month until his wife is finally able to find the fake passports, and they're able to get out of the country and reunite with their son. A few years later, Dr. Miller is old enough to enlist in the Army, in the U.S. Army during World War II, and because he speaks German, he's really valuable, and he's used to interrogate Nazi prisoners. And then today, as I mentioned in the book, he's 97. He still visits schools in Cincinnati twice a month, telling his personal story, but also the larger story of the Holocaust. And he says, he was a witness to history, and as a witness, he has an obligation and a responsibility to talk about it. And I asked him, well, what do you tell kids? So when they ask you, how do we make sure nothing like this ever happens again? And he says the kids in school typically already know the answer. He tells them they've already said the answer out loud that morning with their hand over their heart when they recited the Pledge of Allegiance. And he said the most important thing to remember is the last 5 words of the pledge, which are liberty and justice for all, and not to forget the all part and the for all part. And when we've seen what's happened throughout history in Europe and the United States, all over the world, when people forget or intentionally leave out the for all part and say that certain freedoms and rights are only for some people and other people are inherently unworthy of those freedoms. And so he's here as a witness to the Holocaust to remind us that. And I think it's a really important lesson, and it's the message that I leave readers of the book with in the final pages.
Let's take another break. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Let's go ahead and get back to the interview.
You wrote the book. It's written for young adults, and so I really appreciate that it's written for young adults. It's very engaging. It deals with some very difficult topics of racism here in the U.S., of the Holocaust, of horrible things in history, but really important things. And you write it in such a way that's very engaging and easy to read, and you address these issues so that they can be understood. And we're still facing a lot of these same issues today. So what has been the reaction from the young adults who have read the book? Are they, do they read it because of the basketball and then find out history, or how are they reacting?
Right. It's been really enjoyable. I love visiting schools. Before the world's been shut down here over the last week or so, I visited a lot of schools already. With this book, I've been to 26 states between this book and my previous one, Strong Inside. Maybe you need to ask them. I feel like the kids like it a lot. I think part of the reason why I write sports or sports-related books is because I think sports are accessible, and so most people, whether they like sports or not, are familiar with them, and it doesn't seem intimidating to read a book about a U.S. basketball team, in the Olympics. That could appeal to a wide range of people. And then once they get into it, the story is broader than just the basketball. It's not just about, how games turned out, but the state of the world at that time. And I try to write in a way that is not, lecturing kids, or is not boring history. I was a history major in college. I love history. And so I think the best way to write it is through stories of people, and not just facts and figures and dates to memorize or something like that, but to write about what it felt to be Al Miller, a 13-year-old kid living in Berlin at the time of the Olympics, or what it felt like to be one of the basketball players there, what it was like, even the fun parts, riding the boat from New York to Germany. And I printed the menu in the book so that young people could see what did people eat in the 1930s. And I think that's what makes history come alive is to write about people and their stories, and that's so something we can all relate to. I think that teachers are interested, and librarians are interested in the book for a couple of reasons. One, typically schools have a subset of kids that are really into sports or maybe really into video games, but they're not reading books yet. And a lot of times a sports cover will attract those kids. And then, studying the Holocaust is something that kids do in school. And so this book is another way to approach that subject. And I think that because it deals with the years before World War II, it's a little bit different than a lot of other books dealing with that time period. And that's where I think the most important lessons and the most important connections to today's world can be drawn from. Unfortunately, what was the world like during these early days of fascism? What was the world like during days of segregation and racism? And unfortunately, there's too many parallels to today, but it's what makes it a relevant book. And that's why I'm excited to have an opportunity to talk about it with young people. And at the same time, I'll say, and I think you have felt this way when we talked the first time, it's a book for young adults, but it's a book for adults too. A lot of the readers have been adults. It's just a little shorter than a typical adult book with fast-paced chapters, trying to keep the reader motivated to continue turning the page. But I don't think that any adult would feel like they're reading a kid's book when they're reading it. It's basically the difference is it's shorter.
Absolutely, and I also was a history major in college, and I completely agree. The books and the texts that drew me in the most were the ones that were social history, that were the specific stories of people during those times, rather than just dates and battles and politics, stuff like that. So
right.
It's definitely a lot more engaging that way.
Yeah, I completely agree, and thanks for saying so.
You're welcome. What are you working on now?
Well, one, I guess, unintended or good consequence of staying home with the coronavirus, not that I have it, but this staying home is having a chance to finish my next manuscript, which is a story called Singled Out. It's a biography of a man named Glenn Burke, who was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. He played for the Dodgers and the A's in the late 70s. I'm in the editing phase of that book right now. I think the first time we spoke, I was maybe a few chapters away from finishing. Now I've written all the chapters. I'm gathering photographs for the book, making a final round of edits. This book is scheduled to come out next March, so about a year from now. Publishing industry is being hit like every other industry right now, and so I'm not sure how things might change, if they do at all, with this book. But hopefully about a year from now, people will be able to read the story of Glenn Burke, who was a fascinating person. He grew up in Oakland and Berkeley. As I mentioned, played for the Dodgers and the A's. He was run out of baseball because of his sexuality, became a softball star in San Francisco in the Castro district in the early 80s. But then, that area in the country affected by AIDS, and Glenn Burke died of AIDS in the mid 90s. So it's a story with a tragic ending, but an important figure in the history of sports that most people don't know. And so I'm excited to bring his story to the world.
Yeah, I had not heard of him, so I'm intrigued. I mean, it's definitely a time in history when not many people at all were coming out as gay, let alone athletes. So he was incredibly courageous in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing, when I've been to schools talking about games of deception, and students will ask me, what are you working on next? And then I bring up this story, to middle schoolers, they don't miss a beat. I think when I was in middle school, if an author had said they were working on a book on a gay baseball player, I think a lot of the boys in the room would have laughed or snickered or something like that. And I've been really encouraged that has not been the case at all in any of the schools that I've been to. And so I'm really excited to see how how middle schoolers, high school students will react to this book.
Yeah, I'm intrigued as well. You mentioned your first book, Strong Inside, and a little bit about that story. You also have, am I remembering correctly, a graphic novel of that book as well?
A young reader's edition. It's not a graphic
young
novel.
Reader. There we go.
I do have a young reader's edition. Yes. So I initially wrote the book for adults, and that book came out in the end of 2014. And then some of your listeners may be familiar with the author of historical fiction named Ruta Sepetys. Ruta lives here in Nashville, and she's a mentor of mine. She wrote books called Between Shades of Gray, Assault to the Sea. Her new book is Fountains of Silence. And she suggested that I adapt Strong Inside for young readers. And thanks to her advice, I did. And so that book has been really enjoyable for me to tell that story. I first wrote about Perry when I was a student in college myself, and came back to it 17 years later to write the initial adult biography. But I've loved visiting schools telling the story of American civil rights through the lens of a college basketball player. And again, I think it's a way to talk about history through sports in what I think is a compelling and accessible way for a lot of kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's time for our final break of the podcast. When we come back, Andrew will be giving his advice for aspiring authors. I will prove that I don't know the difference between fiction and nonfiction. I really do, but it's not going to sound like I do. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Andrew Maranis.
So out of your journey to coming to publishing historical fiction, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Yes, in historical nonfiction, just to be clear. But my advice is...
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
I blame sheltering in place. It's melting my brain.
Yeah. Hey, you've been doing great. I would say, first of all, is just simply to do it. And that's easier said than done, but a lot of times people have an idea for a book, and I think they maybe overthink it and imagine all the reasons why they can't do it, or why it won't work. Just to do it, especially now with self-publishing. That's what I was going to do. After having spent 8 years on Strong Inside and striking out in every conversation I had with agents and publishers, I decided if no one was going to publish it, I would self-publish it. Luckily, that didn't have to happen. I found Vanderbilt University Press, who published my initial edition of Strong Inside, and then I've been with Philomel, which is part of Penguin, for the Young Readers Edition and for Games of Deception and for Singled Out. But I think just having the experience of doing the research and actually writing the book, whether it had ever been published or not, was a really important just life experience for me to get to do that. And I think that a lot of other people would probably feel the same way. You get obsessed with the topic, for better and worse, mostly for the better, but there's nothing like, for me, doing that research, writing the chapters, having that sense of satisfaction and accomplishment in and of itself, regardless of sales or other people reading the book. is a great feeling. And so one piece of advice I would have is to just do it. If you're interested in writing fiction, the other advice is to really devote the proper amount of time to the research and not to be in too big of a hurry to start writing. When I think most people assume that the writing is the important part or the fun part. That's what you're writing a book. So of course you would think that, but you can't short shrift or sell yourself short on that research. Every single sentence, as I mentioned earlier, is a product of the research, not of just using imagination to imagine what someone might have said or what something might have looked or felt like. It really has to come from interviews or from research. And so really doing the work is critically important. Those would be my two biggest pieces of advice.
Thank you for that. When you then take the time to read, maybe not for research, but for yourself, what are your favorite genres or authors?
Okay. Maybe not too surprising. It's narrative nonfiction. Is my favorite genre. It's pretty much exclusively what I read. Right now I'm reading a great book by Scott Ellsworth called The World Beneath Their Feet, about sort of the worldwide race to be the first to scale the Himalayas. It's exactly the type of narrative nonfiction that I love, that you can just feel what it was like to be these mountaineers out there in the snow, climbing these mountains, and the level of research that Scott has done is incredible. He also wrote a book that I read as research for Games of Deception. He wrote a book called The Secret Game, which was a book about a basketball game played behind closed doors in front of no fans between Duke and a historically black college in North Carolina around World War II era during segregation in the United States. It was a fascinating book. So I love books by Scott. My father, David Maraniss, has written 12 or 13 books. They're all historic nonfiction, narrative nonfiction also. So he's been a huge influence in my life. I've always loved Bill Bryson, Eric Larson, and then I mentioned Ruda, who's become my mentor here in Nashville. She's a favorite fiction author of mine with her historical fiction.
Thanks. And how about your kiddos? You said they're 6 and 9. What are they reading, especially now that they're at home?
Yeah. Well, I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son, as you mentioned. Every night, my wife has been reading Harry Potter to them. I think they're on to the 4th book right now. They've got the illustrated versions of the Harry Potter books, and so they love doing that together. They love a series called The Ballpark Mysteries, which are mysteries for kids that take place in Major League Baseball stadiums. And so as a sports fan, I'm loving those books too. My daughter has discovered Beverly Cleary, so she's reading some books that my wife and I remember from childhood. And my son was reading my son was reading a little Star Wars book just this afternoon. So we definitely, while we're all home together, devote an hour or more during the afternoon to all sitting around and reading, and then they read at bedtime every night as well.
Wonderful. I love that. So I know you have a website. If you can give us the website and tell people where they can find you to interact with you on social media, or if you have contact information on your website.
Sure. So my website is just my name, andrewmaranis.com, and Maraniss is Maraniss. So you can find me there. There's a contact form there if you'd like to reach out. Also, I'm on Twitter all the time. My Twitter handle is TrueBlue24 without the E's. So it's TRUBLU24 is my Twitter handle. I'm on Instagram, my first initial and last name, so A Maraniss on Instagram. And I would encourage anyone to get in touch with me any one of those ways. I love interacting with readers. I'd love to hear what people have to say about the books.
All right. Thank you for that. So we've talked about a lot. I don't remember if we had, any fabulous conversation last time that we didn't cover this time, but is there anything you can think of that we didn't talk about that you wanted to cover?
No, this has been a great interview, Sarah. I really appreciate it. That's the only thing I wanted to say is that as an author, and I think I can speak for other authors in saying thank you for doing what you do to allow authors to share stories about their books, talk about their books. The opportunities to do that are not what they used to be. There really aren't book review sections in newspapers the way they used to be. And so podcasts are a wonderful opportunity to do that. I think now with people, staying at home for the safety of all of everyone, that it's a good time to be reading. And I've seen that by looking at social media that some people are rediscovering the joy of reading. Other people are looking forward to this opportunity to read. And so your podcast is especially relevant right now, but it always is. And so thank you for doing it.
No, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. And people are definitely having to find different ways to entertain themselves right now. So
that's right.
Read, people. It's good for you.
Yes, and I will say I know that I saw that Amazon is limiting non-essential sales. And my first advice to people is always to buy a book at an independent local bookstore. But if people can't get out of the house to do that, I think they may have been turning to Amazon. But I don't know if you can even order a book off Amazon, at least in the short term. So I will say in my case and in most other authors' cases that maybe an ebook would be an option, or there's an audio version of Games of Deception now also. And so those are alternatives if it's difficult to find a hard copy of the book at the present.
Right. Yeah. Oh, good. There's an audiobook. I love audiobooks. So that's awesome. Yeah. And if you can get one of those subscriptions for places like Audible, where you pay a flat fee and then you can use it like a library, so you can check out audiobooks and then return them. And so cool. Yeah.
And then there are a number of independent bookstores that are allowing people to order from the store, and they're offering free or reduced shipping at this time. It's an important period to support local bookstores right now, where they don't have customers coming into the store. So I would really highly encourage people to support their favorite local bookstore by ordering online right now if they can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, a second time, to talk to me about your books. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Sarah.
Thank you again to Andrew for not only doing one interview, but doing two. So, we'll just call that first one a dress rehearsal and move on from there. Thank you again to Andrew. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I hope you are having, I hope that your weekend is as good as it can be, depending on your shelter in place or mandatory lockdown or whatever it is that you are experiencing this weekend. But chances are good you are definitely going to have time to read and get lost in that good book. So I hope that is the case for you. And I hope that you will tune in on Tuesday for my next interview. I'll be interviewing Naomi McDougall-Jones about her new book, The Wrong Kind of Women. It is about women in the film industry. If you listen to the GSMC movie podcast, you may remember that Tate and I interviewed her last summer, I believe, about the movie Bite Me, which she wrote and produced and starred in. And she's a lot of fun, so I'm looking forward to speaking with her about her new book and learning more about some pretty major issues that women face in the film industry. So join me for that on Tuesday. And again, in the meantime, have a great weekend and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.